To kick the morning off, we have something which I think is very special. I think Ken Robinson and creativity, when you use those two words together, they're synonymous, they're interchangeable. I think when most of us think of creativity, particularly in the context of education, we think of Sir Ken Robinson, someone who doesn't really need any great introduction because of that. And certainly had we, as we did when we sat down last January to start thinking about today, in terms of whom we might want to feature at conference, Sir Ken Robinson was top of the list. International globetrotter, commands, I suppose, as a result of that, quite a large fee. Only likes to travel business class, and why wouldn't he when you're travelling over from Los Angeles and so forth? So it was always unlikely that we would be able to have him here physically. But thinking creatively in relation to a conference on creativity, we thought that the next best thing might be to entice him to provide us with a chunk of his thinking, a chunk of his inspiration, some of his wonderful insights, specifically for this conference. So we had an opportunity last March when he was working in Derry. We had an opportunity of essentially meeting up with him and doing an interview, specifically, as I say, for this particular conference. So he knew the kind of audience to whom the points and comments that he will be making. He knew the kind of audience for which this is for. And I do know that he's genuinely interested in the kind of response which his comments this morning will elicit. As with all of yesterday's proceedings, so also this morning, we are recording them, so we will actually have the opportunity of being able to feed back to him by video your response to what he will be challenging you with. We have about an hour and a quarter in total of interview material, too much obviously to try and put into this morning's conference, so we have engaged in just some editing to try and make sure that those parts of the interview which perhaps relate most directly to what we are about and to what you might be interested in, we've edited it so as to get the best out of what we got. But those of you involved in teacher education, there is much about the full hour and a quarter which I think you will be interested in and will have a use for back in your own institutions. So our intention coming out of all of this morning is to make the entire interview available to you through the SCoTENS website, through the Pushkin website, through other websites. And I do know that whether you're working with your student teachers or working with more experienced teachers, with more seasoned campaigners, there is much within the Robinson material that I know you will be interested in and will have a great use for. For the purposes of this session, we have split his material into three parts. There's an opening 11-minute, 12-minute piece where he talks generally about the state of teacher education, the directions perhaps that it needs to take, some of the tensions that are implicit and explicit within it. So our intention is to play this first 11 minutes, and then on your tables you will find, under the heading of Workshop 1, a number of questions which we would like you to consider just for about 7 to 8 minutes in relation to what you will have heard. We then go into a second part, which lasts about 21, 22 minutes, where he speaks much more directly on the theme of creativity, including his definition of it, the challenges that he believes it presents to us as teacher educators and as teachers. And I think that will take you into the heart of the conference theme. And again, after playing that, the intention, the hope is that you will use the sheet workshop 2 on your tables to share some thoughts and some comments with each other about what it is that you will just have heard. And it would be nice, as I say, because he has produced this for us in this bespoke kind of way, it would be nice perhaps if we took some audible feedback from you, so that that is the kind of response that we will be able to provide him with. And then there's a third piece of the Robinson material which we have pointedly left until the very end of this morning. We've built it as a call to action. We pointedly thought it important to ask him about how optimistic he was for the future of the creativity agenda in the context of the schooling systems that we inhabit, and I think you will be enthralled by the kind of response that we got to that. So we have left that to the very end of the morning, just to make sure that you come back from your sort of checking out journey mid-morning. So I hope you enjoy it, and then I'll say something more after the Robinson material. I'll say something more about the other presentations and speakers that we have lined up for this morning. So if we're clear about that, as you can see in front of you, this was a discussion with Sir Ken on the theme of optimising creativity in teachers and students and the implications for you. So, first part now coming up. Well, good morning, Sir Ken. Before beginning our conversation, our thanks to the Duchess of Abercorn for allowing us to use the inspirational Pushkin House here in the Baronscourt estate as the backdrop to our conversation about creativity and its importance to teacher educators. As you know, the theme of our SCoTENS conference this autumn is creative teachers, creative learners, and the implications for teacher education. Our aim this morning is to have a conversation around this theme and for the content of our discussions to be used by the many teacher educators across the island of Ireland who will attend the SCoTENS conference. Our thanks to you for making this happen. So let's begin at the beginning. Why is creativity an important topic for teacher educators?
Well, to me it's absolutely central to teacher education. Insofar as it should be seen as lying at the heart of education itself. The roles of teachers are absolutely critical. There was a great book published about, I don't know, 25 years ago now, I should think, by Peter Brook, the theatre director. And he is devoted to theatre, the power of theatre, and to ensuring that theatre is the most powerful experience it can be. And his view, though, is that most theatre isn't that at all. It's a kind of waste of time, really. It passes the evening, but it would have passed anyway. And he says, so if we're interested in really making theatre the most vibrant experience possible, we need to be clear what we're talking about. So what is theatre exactly? And to answer his own question, he performs a sort of thought experiment. This is, by the way, in a book called The Empty Space. And his thought experiment is, what can you remove from a theatre performance and still have theatre? What's the irreducible core of the experience? So he says, well, you can take away the curtains, you can take away the script. A lot of theatre is not scripted. You can take away the lighting, as long as you can see it, actually, even if you can't. You can get rid of the stage crew. You can get rid of the costumes, the stage itself. You don't need it. A lot of theatre doesn't have a stage. You can get rid of the building. You don't need any of that. You don't need any of it. He said the only thing you need, essentially, for theatre is an actor in a space and an audience. And that audience can just be one other person. Because theatre is the relationship between the audience and the actor. The actor may be performing a drama, but it's the fact of it being witnessed that creates the relationship. That is theatre. That's the heart of it. And he said that, in his view anyway, you should never add anything to that relationship unless it helps. If it doesn't, take it out. Well, to me, the analogy with teaching is exact. That at the heart of education is the relationship between a teacher and a learner. That's it. You can get rid of everything else. You can get rid of national standards, curricula, buildings, building codes, union negotiating positions, subject disciplines, departments, timetables, schedules. All of those things have been added to the relationship. You would like to think to facilitate it. But as often as not, they actually get in the way of it. And in fact, you can hear people talking all day long about education without ever discussing the relationship between teachers and learners. Mm-hmm. But if that's wrong, there's no education going on. There may be something else happening, but it's not education. So for me, the professionalism of teachers is at the heart of educational transformation. And particularly the idea that teaching is an art form. You know, it's one thing for teachers to know their material, they should. But knowing your discipline doesn't make you a great teacher. That just makes you a great scholar of your own material. And there are plenty of great scholars who are not very good teachers. Mm-hmm. Teaching is the process of enabling other people to learn. And that involves engaging their imaginations, their interests, and their energies, and stimulating their creativity. So insofar as creativity is a priority for education, and we may talk more about that, and I believe it is, the roles of teachers can't really be exaggerated. Mm. The thing is that you can't expect anybody to teach something they themselves don't feel or understand. You can't, I believe, expect teachers to enable creative development among students if they themselves don't feel the process, if they haven't experienced it. It would be like expecting somebody to teach Hungarian who doesn't speak it. You know, saying to them, you know, we'd like you to take the 4th years for Hungarian lessons after break, you know, but I don't speak Hungarian. Oh, go on, you know, have a go, see how you get on with it. So the implication to me is that we need to re-establish the art form of teaching and to recognise that to enable creative development has implications for pedagogy. And therefore, we ought to be providing the pedagogical training and development in initial teacher education and professional development programs to enable teachers themselves to understand and feel the experiences we want them to promote among their students.
You bring the education function down to its essential core as a means of highlighting the centrality of the teacher and pupil above all other mediating factors in optimizing learning. What are the implications of this in terms of what happens in teacher education? Indeed, if creativity is to be an essential output of learning, what are the elements of good teacher education?
I mean, good teachers need several skill sets. One of them is a knowledge of their own field, their own discipline. And another is the process of pedagogy, of the thing they have to practice. The third thing that they need, I believe, is a knowledge of the traditions in which they stand. I don't mean they need to be confined by them, but I think it's often forgotten that education as a profession has a long and noble history. Mm-hmm. There have been great pioneers always. Many of the questions that people struggle with just now have been at the heart of educational debate for generations. It's like John Dewey once said that every generation has to rediscover democracy for itself. Mm-hmm. You have to feel these practices and these principles in action. And many of the things that people currently struggle with have been at the heart of the debate about education processes really since the beginning of formal education and beyond that. The truth is, we know what works in education. I really believe that. And the centre of it is, say, this relationship and the need to personalise education. So the elements of good teacher education are sustained practical experience, hands-on doing it. It is at the end a practical profession like medicine in its way. So I'll just say about that, the reason I make that comparison is that if you visit a doctor a consultant of any sort, or a lawyer, you want them to be really well informed in their field of practice, and you want them to have a whole repertoire of practical experiences to draw from. But what you also want them to do is to apply all of that expertise selectively in your case. It's like if you go to a good restaurant and you ask the advice of a sommelier. There may be racks and racks of wines, but their job is to work out, and using their judgment connoisseurship, what's appropriate here and now. And at the heart of teaching is this process of connoisseurship, of refined judgment about knowing what the right thing is. It's why I constantly say that the job of teachers is to teach students, not subjects, because you're drawing from what you need them to know, but you're applying it to them and seeing what difficulties they may be having, or what the point of entry is for them. So the heart of good teacher education is sustained practice. But there is also a very important place for theory, because this division that's often been made between theory and practice is very ill-conceived. I mean, good practice is always informed by clear thinking and a knowledge of principles and of tradition. And so there's a very long tradition here to draw from. So the problem as I see it in many forms of teacher education at the moment is that teaching is too often seen, I think, politically as some form of delivery system. I really dislike this language. I don't know when it really crept into our lexicon. People talk about delivering the curriculum, and the students are the hapless people to whom it's actually being delivered. And a lot of education reform is content driven and assessment driven. Well, all those things matter, but they only matter in relation to this process of facilitating learning in the first place.
You seem to be suggesting that due to many factors, education reformers, whether at the systems level or at institutional level, have lost their way, lost focus on what is important. How can teacher educators avoid this trap of losing sight of what is important? And what is it, as teacher educators, that we must focus on?
I think what's happened in education over a number of years, and therefore it gets projected to teacher education, is that we've lost the focus of our attention. The focus has shifted onto things that should be subsidiary. The focus has become focused on, our attention has become focused on particular sorts of standards, on content of various sorts, and it's often at the expense of the quality of learning. So my hope is that we'll see forms of teacher education which get the balance back in the right proportion, that there would be a more effective balance between theory and practice, and that the art of pedagogy would be central.
So our next part, as I say, we're moving more directly into the creativity theme and his thoughts on this. I get a sense that amidst the trials and tribulations of education reform as it has been erstwhile promoted, that the importance of education as an educational, indeed learning agenda in its own right, has yet to move centre stage. Perhaps this is the missing link in what up to now has been attempted under the banner of education reform and transformation. Given your passionate belief in creativity as at least part of the solution to these challenges, and for the teacher educators listening, is it possible to teach, create, develop, nurture a creative teacher?
Absolutely, yeah. The thing is, you have to define it, you see. You have to define creativity. I can remember when I was chairing the National Advisory Committee on Creative and Cultural Education, where they produced the report, All Our Futures, that became the foundation of unlocking creativity in Northern Ireland. I remember talking to one of the ministers at the time who'd commissioned the report, and the background for it was that the government at the time, in the late 90s, was talking a huge amount about creativity and the importance of promoting it. And I was delighted. I thought, well, this is great, at long last, to have a government who gets it. And then they presided over a series of measures in education which were indistinguishable from the administration they'd replaced. And whatever else they might be trying to achieve, the education reform movement could never have been accused of promoting creativity. On the contrary. So I was in touch with the government at the time, and I said, look, if you're serious about promoting creativity, let's be serious about it. Because what you're doing is crushing it. And if you're not serious, then stop talking about it, because this is confusing everybody. And my point was that you can teach creativity systematically. There's an interesting analogy for me with literacy. Nobody questions that you can teach people to be literate, and that you can do that strategically and systematically. No, we want people to be able to read and write, but we don't leave it to chance. We don't think, well, wouldn't it be great? Let's hope they do. We'll leave some books around and see if anybody shows an interest in them. Or we'll leave some calculators in the classroom and see if anybody picks one up. There's a strategy to do it. And my point was, the analogy was direct. You could do that. But I remember one of the ministers saying to me, of course, the trouble is you can't define creativity. And I said, no, I think the trouble is you can't, because you haven't thought about it. And this is one of the problems. People think they know what creativity is, but they don't. They haven't thought about it. And what they have is a set of assumptions they haven't questioned for years. And they run something like this. You know, people think that creativity is something to do with free expression, that it's just doing whatever you think, relieving the pressure from yourself and letting it happen. Or it's associated only with the arts. So when people say they're not creative, and most adults will say that, what they really mean is they're not artistic, by which they mean I haven't learnt to play an instrument, or I haven't been taught to draw, or I've never had any experience dancing properly, or in other words, I've not developed any particular artistic expertise. But I'm a tireless advocate of the arts in schools. But creativity isn't the same thing. You can be creative in maths, in science, in technology. Or people think that creativity is about special people. Only a select few are really creative, and that's simply not true. We're all born with immense creative capacities. So I wanted to present a case to show that it's about everybody and it's about everything, but you have to define it. And so we did define it, and we defined it as the process of having original ideas that have value. Now, the point about this is that you can't be creative in the abstract. I think there is that view that there are some people who are just creative. Well, you can be creative at anything, but you have to be creative at something. You can't be creative if you don't do anything. So creativity is a practical process of applying your imagination to a set of issues or challenges. And it could be anything. It could be working on a mathematical puzzle. It could be creating a building like this. It could be designing a camera like that. It could be writing a poem. What you're looking at is a process of coming up with original ideas that have value. So assessment at that point, for example, becomes feasible. People say you can't assess creativity. Well, not in the abstract, no. But you can, as soon as you recognise that it's a function of something particular. So if you want to judge whether somebody's being creative, the first question is, well, what are they doing? Is this a creative piece of architecture? Is this an original piece of music? Is this an original mathematical theorem? Is this an original design? Is this an original movie? And then you apply criteria that are relevant to the field that you're looking at. So in just the same way that I know that you can assess creativity, you can teach it. But again, the reason people think that you can't teach it is because they often work from a very limited conception of teaching. They think of teaching often as instruction. I can't teach you to be creative like I can teach you to dismantle that camera and put it back together again. There is much more to teaching than instruction. It's why I was saying earlier that the job of a teacher is to facilitate learning, to enable it. What you can do is facilitate creative development.
Sir Ken, in your much celebrated All Our Futures, you made what I think is a very crucial, even profound distinction between teachers teaching creatively and teachers teaching for creativity. What is the difference between these two key themes?
The difference is that great teachers are very creative themselves in the design of lessons and encounters and forms of experience that engage the interests and imaginations of their students. They don't just look to instruction, they look to create situations where people will want to learn. I started out in education as a drama teacher, and drama teachers are, at their best, tremendously good at creating situations that engage the imaginations of their students and students with each other. So teaching creatively is, I think, the joy and the passion and the responsibility of all great teachers. Mm-hmm. But then there's teaching for creativity, where what you're trying to do is to create the conditions where people develop their own creative skills. And that's a related set of pedagogies too. So as soon as you define what you're talking about, as soon as we recognise that creativity is related to practical things, then these questions that seem puzzling in the abstract about, well, can you teach it, can you assess it, simply resolve themselves fairly quickly.
This juxtaposition between teachers teaching creatively and teachers teaching for creativity, can we focus on this a little longer? In terms of the implications of such for teacher education, are there any practical examples of what these teaching modes, if I might so describe them, might look like?
Well, I think that the implications are that students need to be helped to understand the pedagogies that are entailed in both these approaches. That they need to be encouraged and helped, facilitated to develop creative teaching strategies of their own. I mean, I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine, a guy called Richard Gerver, who I do some work with, ran a very successful school in Derbyshire. A school that was failing, but which he was able, with his teachers, to turn around. I remember he told me about a series of lessons he did as part of the National Literacy Strategy, where they had to teach paragraphing. Well, you know how exciting that can be, learning all about paragraphs. And one way of teaching paragraphing would be to tell the kids at the beginning of the week, this is what a paragraph is, these are the circumstances in which we create paragraphs, these are the reasons for having paragraphs, analyse these pieces of writing and tell me how many of these paragraphs meet these criteria, and at the end of the week we'll have a test. I mean, you can invent that lesson, the conventional instructional method. What he actually did was he went in to this group of kids, I think they were 9-year-olds, on the Monday morning, and asked them if any of them knew the series EastEnders on television, and they, of course they all did. And he said, would you like to watch an episode? And they said, what, now? He said, yeah. And they said, well, duh, So he played them an episode of EastEnders, and he got them to tell him all about it, the characters, the situation. He said he didn't know about it, which he didn't, and they all did. And then he said to them, just tell me, while we're looking at this, why do they keep moving the camera around? And the kids looked at him as if he'd lost it and said, well, because it's a different scene. This is that's in the pub, and this is in the cafe, that's somebody's house. He said, I know that, but even within the cafe, they keep moving the camera around. And they said, well, because they were explaining this to him as if he was half-witted. They said, because somebody's speaking and they're showing their reaction to it. And so they explained what they'd probably never fully articulated before, but had absorbed over years, the basic principles of editing a movie and of camera shots. So that was great. The next lesson, he went in with some printed pages from a book that he liked, and he said, we looked at EastEnders yesterday, I'd like to read you this example from this book, a story I like. So they sat down and they indulged him, and he read the story, and they had the pages in front of them, and he did all the stories, and they loved it, and asked lots of questions about the story. And then he said to them, why do you think the page is broken up like this? And they hadn't noticed. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you look at the page, some of the lines start a bit in, they're not all the same length, and they end at different points. It's jagged. And they looked at it and they started to describe the different reasons why that might happen. They speculated. And they came up with all kinds of possibilities. And they said, oh, well, this is because somebody's speaking here, isn't it? Or this is a description of what's happening. And that's what somebody's thinking. And then one of the kids said, because the penny dropped, is it like a camera shot? He said, exactly, that's exactly what it is. He said, because if you've got a camera, you can move it. But if you're a writer with a page, you can't keep moving the book. But what you can do is move the words around. And they got the analogy exactly, that paragraphing is like editing a movie. So he got them to say how many different reasons they thought there could be for having a paragraph. And they came up with a whole list of them. So the third lesson was he gave them unformatted text from the same book and got them into groups, said, okay, edit these pages in the way that you think makes the very best sense, that like the most impact. And he said, within a few minutes, the kids were on their feet, shouting at each other, saying, that's ridiculous, you'd never put a paragraph there. Why would you put a paragraph in the middle of somebody speaking? Well, the thing is, they will never forget the purpose of paragraphing. They got it artistically, grammatically, functionally, and it happened because he bridged across to something they knew already. Now, I just think it's a brilliant piece of creative teaching. Far better, far more effective than giving them a list of paragraphs and getting them to do some dry analytical study of the page in front of them. It engaged their imaginations and engaged them creatively. Well, there are just lots and lots of examples. That one is one that just comes to mind, but the teachers I remember are the ones who were like that. They gave you something challenging and interesting to do. That's what drama is about. It's what great mathematics teaching is about. It's not just giving people information hoping they'll absorb it. It's creating challenges and situations where their imaginations are engaged, where they want to learn and feel the challenge of doing that. So part of the implication for teacher education is to expose student teachers to that sort of pedagogy and to give them the challenges to come up with creative ways of mediating their own material and to watch other people do it and to learn from each other. The other is that teaching for creativity, to me, has two distinct but related strands. I think of this as personal creativity and general creativity. What I mean is that there are certain skills, processes, procedures that anybody can learn to think more productively. People like Edward de Bono, groups like Synectics, have come up with proprietary methods, like 6 thinking hats and the techniques of brainstorming and the rest, where you can apply techniques in almost any situation to help you free your own thinking up, to break your own habitual modes of thought, to generate ideas more quickly and more easily. See, in any creative process, it seems to me there are 2 related strands. One of them is to generate ideas, and the other is to act critically upon them. So there are techniques that help you generate more ideas. And I say there are lots of methods out there, there are all kinds of books that are addressed to that. These are general skills of creative thinking, and I think students should learn them. They should be encouraged to practice them, to have them in their repertory of teaching techniques, and they should pass them on to their children. We should be teaching the skills of creative thinking at a general level. But there's also personal creativity, which is really implicit in the book I published a couple of years ago called The Element, Finding Your Passion Changes Everything. What I mean is that in addition to and beyond general thinking skills that we can all learn, we all have very particular talents and interests, very different styles of learning, which are particular and peculiar to us. For some people, they come alive in music, and maybe not music in general, but the flute. They come alive in sport, and not all sports, maybe, but football, or whatever it is they play. For some people, they come alive when they're doing mathematics, because they're in their element, it's their medium. So part of teaching for creativity is teaching general teaching skills. So part of teaching for creativity is teaching general skills of creative thinking. But the other is being alert to the different ways in which students learn and the different ways that they in particular light up if they work with particular medium or materials. And that level of personal creativity has big implications for the curriculum as a whole. But my general point here is that as soon as you start to break it down, there are whole repertories of techniques, of skills that teachers, if we're interested in creativity in classrooms and schools, should be exposed to and be helped to practice and develop during the process of their initial training and subsequently in service training.
If I understand you correctly, you seem to be suggesting the need for deliberateness in all of this, a consciously thought out intention on the part of the teacher to develop the competencies and the skill sets of pupils in creativity. Would I be correct in this?
I would encourage the specific intention. Yes, that's right, that we should be teaching these things deliberately, in just the same way as we teach literacy, deliberately. And literacy isn't, again, an abstract set of ideas, it's a set of practical competencies. You know, there are words on the page that you're trying to decode. There's a process, you know, through which you're trying to encode your own thoughts. I remember one of the great revelations to me as a student was when I encountered the work of people like Vygotsky and Sapir and Piaget and Benjamin Whorf and the rest, who in their various ways worked in the fields of language and thought and applied linguistics. People like James Britton and Harold Rosen at the London Institute that I worked with eventually. And their core idea, you know, the thing that sort of, the idea they gathered around in their different ways, that I found was such a revelation was that that language isn't just the way in which we express our ideas, it's how we have them. It's one of the ways in which we formulate ideas, that many of the ideas we have come into being through our attempts to frame them in words. And consequently, the words we have at our disposal, the languages that we speak, have a dynamic relationship with the thoughts that we eventually formulate, that we can only think in certain ways if we have language available to us. I mean, at the very practical level, if you look at a table or a chair, well, all languages have words for those sorts of things, and the object's there anyhow. But when you start to move into more conceptual fields and talk about relationships and principles and philosophies and modes and attitudes and feelings, the ideas that we have to frame those conceptual understandings are very different between languages, and some languages have words that have no equivalent in another language. So that whole relationship I always find very intriguing. So literacy turns out, you know, to be both a series of conceptual skills and practical skills of production and coordination. And it's what I'm saying about creativity, that to be creative is, in any field, also involves mastery of various sorts. You can't be a creative mathematician if you're enumerate. You can't be a creative musician without some competence on the instrument that you're playing. Now, I don't mean to say that, therefore, you have to learn the instrument before you can be creative. You can start right away. I mean, I always think of the Beatles as a great example of that. When they started out, they had 2 or 3 chords, actually 2. They found a third one eventually, a friend of theirs in Liverpool. But they did a lot with it. But as they went on, their creative ambition fueled the growth of their disciplinary control. It's that kind of dialogue, you know, between discipline and imagination that really is the engine of creative growth and development. So yes, I think there should be a deliberate intention to do that. That if we're serious about creativity, and we should be, in all forms of education, then teachers need to learn the skills, the concepts, the processes they want the children to know. And in addition, they need to be helped to develop the pedagogical skills to make those things possible in their classrooms. Yeah, absolutely.
So Ken, and we're getting close to the end, you'll be glad to hear, how optimistic are you for the creativity agenda in terms of its take-up into the future? You have accepted that the backcloth against which it resides is not very conducive. We have a schooling system still dominated by standardisation, prescription and league tables. We have a generation of young folk who have come through a system so dominated, and yet it is to these same young folk that we seek to replenish the teaching profession. So how optimistic would you be that the creativity agenda can be moved forward more substantively than ever before?
Well, firstly, I'm a natural optimist, so I'm not the right person to ask, you know. But you have to be optimistic, or pack up, you know, and do something else. But I am naturally optimistic. But I'm optimistic for good reasons, I think. I have great faith in people. I have great faith in teachers. I've spent my life around them and among them and being one of them. And, I mean, there are bad teachers. Of course there are. There's bad everything. There are bad lawyers, there are bad accountants, bad chefs. They're not bad people, they're just bad teachers. And I think they should do something else and not make themselves miserable. But in my experience, most people who are devoted to teaching do it vocationally, and they do it out of a love of children, a love of learning. They do it because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. And the great frustration we've all felt, I think, is that the attempts by successive governments to reduce education to a delivery system and teachers to functionaries has been both counterproductive and insulting. And the answer is not to de-skill teachers, it's to reskill them and to reinvest in them. It's an old military maxim, you know, that a great general doesn't fire on his own troops. And you can't revitalise education, you can't transform it, you can't make education the great success it's desperately important it must be by demoralising and demeaning the people who are responsible for it. You simply can't do it. Well, if you try it, we know what happens. We see the results of that everywhere. So I have great confidence in the power of great teachers. And our job, I think, is to invest properly in that development. It's why teacher education is so critically important. But I don't minimise the pressures that we all face. We are living through one of the worst recessions in living memory. It's the axe of budget cuts isn't just falling on education, it's falling on the health service, it's falling on every area of the public sector. That's not the fault of teachers either, but there's a need to take a fair share of it, I'm sure. But there are other forces here that make this imperative. You see, I talk a lot about creativity, but creativity is just, to me, it's one part of a much bigger argument. It's a portal into a bigger labyrinth of issues. The fact is that we face challenges now globally that are without precedent. We face them from strains on the environment, population growth. There are cultural challenges, economic challenges, political challenges, fueled and driven by new technology. The world is in a state of tumultuous change, and education is the only way that we can engage people in these changes and see our way through it. And I don't mean to be apocalyptic, but I feel a little that way. I mean, there's a very shrewd comment by H.G. Wells in the early part of the 20th century, one of the few people who seemed to be rather good in the end at making predictions. Not the only one, but one of them. But he once said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. I think that's right. I mean, it's always hard to feel that when you sit in a nice, comfortable place like this, but there are really very far-reaching changes afoot. And the issues that we're talking about are not unique to the island of Ireland. They're global in character. I live in America now. I travel all across America. I travel a lot internationally, to Asia, to Europe. Well, you know where I mean. You know where the world is. I travel around that world that we all live in. And I know that these are issues that are of global significance everywhere. And everywhere, politicians, I think, are misunderstanding the challenge. They have a natural tendency to go into command and control mode. They think they know better because they were elected, I think, and Actually, when it comes to education, they often don't. And they don't seem to grasp, I think, very often. I'm not speaking about every politician everywhere. I'm just saying a trend that you notice you go around, that you can't bring about the changes that are necessary in education by trying to control it all from the centre. You need a national framework of accountability, but you then need to let people get on with the job. It's like in catering, I often talk about that. You can produce standards in catering, but and accountability and standards of hygiene. That's great, but don't start sending recipes to restaurants and telling them what to cook, or what ingredients exactly to be using or what time to be serving it. Let them get on and do their job within that framework. And in schools, I see great work, but it's normally in spite of the dominant culture, not because of it. But the reason I feel optimistic is because I'm optimistic about people generally. Kids always give me reason to be optimistic. And also because I think history is on our side. The current system is simply not tenable. It was designed for other times, for other purposes. And the attempt to command and control isn't tenable. You see that everywhere with political systems. It's happening across the Middle East just now. The real success stories in education are where there's a genuine devolution of responsibility to the people who are in the end responsible. And there are many changes that you see, many social movements that at the time seemed improbable, but which eventually came to be. I'm thinking, for example, of the Green movement. It's only 25 or so years ago when green politics was some eccentric activity in the borders of the European parliaments. It was some activity that was peculiar to Greenpeace or the Rainbow Warrior. And nowadays, world corporations are struggling with each other to say which is the most sustainable. People get it now. I don't mean we've got it enough, or we may not have got it quickly enough, but on the whole, there's a level of consciousness about ecology that was not evident 25 years ago. When I was growing up, everybody smoked. And now, in certainly the developed economies, the old industrial economies, some people smoke, but mostly people don't. The tobacco companies are pushing all their advertising now into the emergent economies and trying to hook kids there. But on the whole, people have made the connection in a way that when I was younger, my parents' generation never did make. Social changes do happen, and great movements happen. And I think that one of the benefits of the internet is people are becoming more and more aware of what's happening in other parts of the world. And of course, the technologies themselves are making available, firstly, access to ideas and information and tools for creative development which are unprecedented. And secondly, they're also creating the circumstances for the personalisation of education which have never existed before. It's now perfectly possible for every child to have an individualised curriculum, their own tools to work on, and for the roles of teachers to be changed from the dominant instructional mode that we all grew up with to one which genuinely is one about enabling and facilitating, because kids have got access to this information, these tools now, in a way that actually goes beyond the skills very often of their own teachers. It doesn't mean we don't need teachers anymore, but their roles are changing. They can become mentors and guides and facilitators in a way that I think is closest to the true vocation of teachers. So it would be wrong, I think, to believe this is a stable situation and that all the power lies at the top. It's a volatile situation, and there's a lot happening that's bubbling up from the bottom. And in the end, revolutions always come up from the bottom. And sensible governments recognise that's what's happening and then say it was their idea. Well, that's all right, let them have that. But I do think the changes will come from the bottom, so to speak, or from the ground level. And I always encourage schools and teachers and people who work in institutions to explore the limits of their own freedom. Very often, I think, schools operate within imaginary constraints, self-imposed constraints. I don't mean we should abandon the bigger struggle. I'm engaged in it every day, trying to push the argument. But in every school, there is freedom to innovate. For example, there isn't anywhere in the legislation that I know that currently governs schools that says you have to divide the day into 45-minute periods. That's just a convention that people have got used to. There's nowhere that says you have to ring a bell. There's nowhere that says you have to have a mid-morning break at the same time for everybody. There's nowhere that says you have to divide the school staff into subject departments. You know, there's nowhere that says you have to educate kids by age group. Why? These are just constraints that we've come to live with. It's like opening the door to a bird cage and the birds just keep sitting there rather than thinking, oh, we could get out of this now. So even though there are constraints, and there are many, creativity often benefits from constraints. And while we should be pushing forward for the larger change, I always want to say to schools as well, explore the limits of your own freedom. And if you can find a better way of doing it within the school you currently have, try it out and see. I think people will surprise themselves at how much creative energy there already is in the system that could be released.
Sir Ken Robinson, on that compellingly persuasive and optimistic note, can I thank you on behalf of the teacher education community across the island of Ireland for giving us your time this morning, as well as for your wonderful wisdom and insights. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks.